Richard threw the pile of papers on the table and roared, unable to cope with his emotions. What a piece of crap. No, look at her, what a bitch. He paced around the office, then pressed the secretary's call button and demanded that she find Stephen. Stephen who, Richard? Susan didn't understand. From the economics department, what's not to understand? Richard shouted, and 5 minutes later he was looking at a confused Stephen. All right, Stephen. Our project is on the verge of failure. We're running out of time. And if I let the investors down, I'll drive you all to hell. I want you to take that into consideration and tell your economic department. As of today, you'll be acting as chief economist, is that clear? Of course, with a pay raise and all privileges. But you're also responsible for a lot more. Everything your department does or doesn't do will be your responsibility. What about Sandra? Sandra has found herself somewhere else, Richard said in a quiet, but ringing with rage, and Stephen had no desire to ask him anything else, but he continued. I realize that the urgent appointment to this position can make you stupefied, but we have no time to hesitate. In 2 days you must find the error in the calculations and provide me with perfectly calculated data. Optimally, if after your work the project is simplified and optimized. Now go, I dare not delay you. Stephen nodded and left the office with a quick step. He had no desire to communicate with the angry chief. Richard had always been characterized by a strict, explosive character, was demanding towards his subordinates and did not let anyone down, not even the chief economist Sandra, his wife. Once they started a business together and in 10 years managed to create a thriving business, which Richard headed. He had all the qualities of a successful entrepreneur. He was determined, hardworking, courageous, driven and fair to his subordinates. Richard realized that his explosive character can only hinder the common cause, and therefore tried to restrain himself as much as possible, not allowing to go beyond the limits of prudence. His wife helped him a lot in this. Beautiful, always well-groomed and elegant Sandra knew her own value and thought that plays the role of Grey Cardinal in her husband. This suited her fine, but not until one day when Richard, who was away on a business trip, called her and asked her to go to a meeting in his place. Sandra, we absolutely have to attend this meeting. We are one of the leading companies in the city and we need to stand up for our interests. Especially since our competitors will be there. Of course, it would be better if I had time to come, but I will definitely not be able to. The meeting with investors is scheduled for tomorrow. I cannot cancel or postpone it. Don't worry so much, dear, Sandra reassured her husband. After all, this is our common business, and I'm not a stranger to it. So, do not worry, everything will be fine. I can assure you, I won't disappear. But she was lost as soon as she saw the brown eyes of her husband Donald's main rival. He was a surprisingly attractive man and Sandra felt the vibe of his charm almost physically. Therefore, when after the meeting he approached her and invited her for a cup of coffee, she could not refuse him. Is there something you want to discuss with me? She asked, when they came to a cozy cafe and made an order. No, Donald smiled softly. I just, if you'll excuse the details, didn't have time for breakfast today, so I thought I'd ask you to keep me company. I don't like to dine alone, and I don't know anyone in your town. All my friends and acquaintances have stayed in the region. I've only recently acquired this business. Where are you staying, a hotel? No, I bought a house in Kedrov. It's big, of course, for me alone, but I hope that soon I will have not only a wife, but also children. Sandra's eyebrows crept upward. Kedrov was a rather expensive, elite settlement of closed type, and only people with very high income could live there. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Don't you have a wife? She did not refrain from asking. No, I've been alone for 4 years now. My ex-wife always wanted to live in London, but I don't like it there. I feel like a stranger abroad, not like here. So, we went our separate ways. As far as I know, she's remarried, and I'm slowly becoming a bachelor. I don't think you're going to make it, Sandra laughed. The female half of our city will not miss such a magnificent specimen, you can be sure of that. And you? Donald asked, looking her straight in the eye and putting his palm over her hand. Sandra flared up as if she were an inexperienced girl. She felt like her heart was about to jump out of her chest. Trying to control herself, she turned away, but did not take her hand away. And a few hours later, coming out of the bathroom in Donald's magnificent house, she smiled at him with the happy smile of a woman in love. She had forgotten everything in the world, had not remembered her husband, or the fact that they had lived so many years together, or the business he had entrusted to her. "I think I've gone mad," she said to Donald, wrapping herself in a soft, fluffy towel. "And I like it so much," he replied and held out his hand to her. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. When Richard returned from his business trip, he immediately noticed that something was going on with his wife, but she didn't answer his questions and only waved away his prying concern. Then he decided that she was just tired of managing the company's affairs alone and suggested that she take a rest. Sandra nodded happily. "That would be good. To be honest, I was going to ask you to do that myself. You wouldn't mind if I went to a sanatorium and spent at least a few days there?" "Of course not, darling, you really deserve a vacation." Soon Sandra left and was gone for almost a week. Except that Richard did not even realize that his wife chose the place of his vacation was not a sanatorium, and the country house of his main competitor Donald. Several months passed. All this time Richard was immersed in work. He couldn't understand what was happening. Profits were down, new contracts were not on the best terms, leading projects were floating out of his hands, and there were clearly ordered inspections. Richard, realizing that he was losing ground, was struggling to get things back on track, but everything was slipping out of his hands. One day he left the office in great irritation and on the doorstep ran into a poorly dressed woman. "Oh, come on!" Richard shouted at her. "Can't you see where you're going?" "Help me, please," she said, holding out her hand to him. "Oh, my God, my God!" Richard exclaimed. "You have to ask for alms near a church, and this is a business center." But despite his indignation, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a bill and slipped it to the beggar. To his surprise, the woman recoiled from him and only waved her hands. "I didn't mean that at all. I'm looking for work. There's a notice on the door that says you need a cleaner." The stranger, her face flaming with shame, quickly named Richard's company. "I just wanted to ask how to find her quickly and who to contact." "Ah," Richard grinned. "I thought you were a beggar." The woman blushed again. "Come on, don't be embarrassed," Richard said. "Go up to the 5th floor and find and tell her Richard's hired you, and she'll get you registered." "Who's Richard?" The woman didn't realize it right away. "It's me. Director and owner of the company where you are going to be employed, and therefore, soon your direct supervisor." "Nice to meet you," the stranger smiled softly. "And my name is Kimberly." Her words were said with such directness that Richard was surprised. He was used to his subordinates being afraid of him, but this future cleaning lady, whom he took for a beggar, spoke to him as an equal. "I'll remember that." He grinned again and, without turning around, continued on his way. In another minute his thoughts returned to his old problems, and he forgot all about Kimberly's existence. And then something happened that knocked him out of his rut for a long time. One evening, he got a call from a good friend of his, someone he'd helped many times before. "Listen, Richard, I've got some news. I don't know how to say this." "David, let's keep it short and to the point," Richard suggested. "I'm tired and I don't want a long explanation." "Whatever you say." "Anyway, Donald has decided to get his hands on your business." "You've heard of it? Where did you hear about it?" Richard asked. "Wait, are you driving?" "Yeah, I'm going home." "Why?" "Park. I'm going to tell you something else, you need to digest this information." "Come on, I'm waiting. I don't want to get in trouble." Richard realized that his friend was not joking, pulled to the curb and turned off the engine. "Talk, I'm all ears." "You're being drowned by your own wife." "Sandra's been seeing Donald for a long time, I only found out today." "But it's a verified source, there's even pictures." "They're different. They're in the car, they're in a restaurant, they're at his house. Anyway, Donald's on the hook for a big man, so he's got him under total surveillance. I happened to come across the photos, so I asked around and got some answers." Richard slapped his palms on the steering wheel with all his might and swore loudly. Then he was quiet for a moment, trying to figure out what to do now. David, can you get me those materials? Just some photos and scans. I don't have access to the full data. Okay, send it over. And thank you. I'm sorry, Richard, but I couldn't say anything. David, you have no idea what you just did for me. I owe you one and I'll never forget it. It's okay, we're used to borrowing from each other, David replied. Richard sat in the car for almost an hour, feverishly thinking how he should behave in this situation. He had long suspected that there was a rat among his team and tried to figure out who it was. But how could you think of his wife? What were you missing, Sandra? Richard asked the void and got no answer. Richard didn't make a grand scandal, he simply told his wife that he knew everything and demanded that she leave. Unlike her husband, Sandra threw him a real tantrum, saying that it was all his fault, that she had long ago not felt like a woman, that he chose the job, not her. And finally, she couldn't resist saying that she had corrected the data in the documents on purpose and now no one would be able to find any mistakes in the calculations. Donald and I will get a new tender, she said to Richard, and we'll go to the Emirates to celebrate our victory. Good riddance. Richard opened the door for her. But when Sandra left, Long Wounded Animal rushed around the apartment, howling with heart-wrenching pain. And in the morning I called Stephen and ordered him to urgently study all the documents and look for errors in the calculations. And that no one should leave the workplace without my permission. He shouted after the newly minted chief economist. At 9 o'clock in the evening, Richard decided to find out how things were going and what had already been done, so he invited the entire economic department to the conference room. The employees came, but could not tell him anything intelligible. With their heads down, they were thinking only about how they could get out of here safely and survive this storm. Richard read it on their faces, and he threw the glass at the wall, shattering it into tiny shards. Strangely enough, this sudden outburst of anger brought Richard's state of mind into relative balance and he looked at his frightened employees and spoke quietly and calmly. He explained the real state of affairs, said what was required of them, told them that if they failed, it would be possible to talk about the bankruptcy of the company. And no one noticed the new cleaning lady, who began to silently remove the shards and wipe the floor with a damp cloth. She listened attentively to what Richard was saying, trying not to miss a word of his speech. When he stopped talking, Stephen rose from his seat. Richard, don't get me wrong. We've had a hard day today, and although it didn't produce the results we wanted, I'm sure we'll get through it. I suggest we all go home and rest today. Tomorrow, come to work an hour later so that you have time to sleep. And in the morning, with renewed vigor, we'll get back to the paperwork. Richard, believe me, we'll do our best not to let you down. He nodded and waved his hand. Break it up. Susan, Richard's secretary, collected all the documents, took them to the chief's office, stacked them on the desk and hurriedly left the office. Richard himself was the last to leave. But when he entered his office in the morning, his jaw dropped from amazement. Behind the desk, in the soft chair of the head was sleeping soundly cleaning lady, putting under her head the very documents that brought him so much trouble. What the hell is this? Richard exclaimed, taken aback by this unceremoniousness. Kimberly looked up and smiled. Ah! Richard, hello. I said, what is this? He rumbled again, already losing his sense of reality. Are you even normal? How are you acting? I found it, Kimberly smiled again. Richard fell silent. He was just confused, not knowing what to say. But Kimberly's next words shocked him. I've done the math and found the errors you mentioned. In addition, I can offer you 2 options to optimize the project, which will make it even more attractive to investors. She talked, and he looked at her and couldn't believe his ears. To understand all this, he finally said, you need an economics degree. I have 2, Kimberly said quite seriously. How? A janitor has 2 college degrees? In economics? Well, you're not born a janitor, you become one, Kimberly sighed. And if you're interested in my education, I'm a qualified mathematician with a specialization in economics. Well, and part-time faculty of World Economy and International Economic Relations, it is, so to speak, for myself, for the soul. I was very interested in this subject. She only now realized that she was sitting in front of the head of the company in his own chair, and he, like a boy, was standing in front of her with his mouth open. This was particularly embarrassing to Kimberly, and she hurried to get up from her seat, but Richard immediately put her back in her chair and sat down beside her. Tell me all about yourself, Kimberly. There's not much to tell. My dad died when I was very young, and my mom quickly found a replacement for him. But I didn't get along with my stepfather, he couldn't stand me, for some reason I was in his way. My mother did not argue with him, and one day they left me, 10 years old, in the care of my grandfather, went abroad and never came back. My grandfather was a professor at the university, which he considered his ancestral home. Should I be surprised that I, when I grew up, also went there and graduated brilliantly? My grandfather loved me very much, but he was not a practical man, unlike his son. While I was studying, I lived in a university dormitory. Well, anyway, after university I actually stayed on the street. The rest is banal. I got married without any dowry, and my husband's family didn't forgive me. For several years they diligently turned him against me and, in the end, convinced him that I am a bad wife, a bad mistress and generally worthless creature. Yeah, well, I'm not much of a cook. Only the simplest dishes, nothing complicated. But I've never had the opportunity to practice it. In my life there were always canteens or cafes, and after marriage for the whole family cook. Well, it doesn't matter. I worked in my husband's family business, keeping the accounts, but it wasn't hard there. Kimberly sighed and stopped talking. But then, looking at Richard, who was listening to her with interest, she continued. The rest was like an unfunny anecdote. One day I went into my husband's office and found him with a young secretary. So I left him. I tried to get a job, but my husband's family created such a reputation for me that I was shunned like a leper. Everyone was afraid to hire a liar and a cheat. Meanwhile, the money, which was already so little, ran out and I had nothing left but to get a job as a janitor or cleaner. That's when I came across your ad. That's all. Here I listened to what your employees are discussing, then you yourself talked a lot about it, and I decided to help. And what? You did it in a couple hours? No, a few nights. What do you mean, nights? You didn't even go home. Kimberly smiled and shrugged. I don't have a home. I slept in train stations, and when you took me here, I slept here in the waiting room on the couch. I asked the guard not to give me up. Such a kind man. Kimberly, I'm gonna have all my boys here, and you can tell them the same thing. Again? Kimberly was surprised. No. I mean this, he pointed to a pile of papers. Oh, yes, of course. Kimberly smiled. I'll tell you everything and show you. Richard stood up and spread his hands. No, it's still unbelievable. I've never heard anything like that. But anyway. Kimberly, there's still time before our staff arrives, let's go to a women's fashion boutique and pick something out for you. You can't go out in front of people in that uniform. Especially since I'm offering you a new high-paying position. Kimberly examined herself. All right. I wouldn't want anyone to mistake me for a beggar again. That's wonderful. Richard exclaimed and smiled. Half an hour later, he couldn't take his eyes off the transformed Kimberly, who looked amazing in her blue pantsuit and blouse. Kimberly, you look amazing, he told her. She smiled embarrassedly and thanked him for shopping. Before returning to the office, they went to a cafe and had breakfast, and then Richard looked with sincere pleasure at the amazed faces of his employees, who both recognized and did not recognize in the beautiful businesswoman yesterday's cleaner Kimberly. They settled down in her new office, and she explained to them the essence of the problem with the calculations so simply and clearly, and so calmly behaved as if she had been working here for 100 years. In the evening, Richard approached her. Kimberly, let's go home. Home? She wondered. Yes, he nodded and took her hand. A few days passed. Richard and Kimberly returned from the meeting with the investors full of enthusiasm. Their project had taken an unquestionable lead, leaving all competitors far behind, including Donald, who had left the meeting before it was over. The employees greeted them with applause, and Richard immediately organized a buffet for everyone. 3 months later, everyone was at Richard and Kimberly's wedding and wished them happiness. Stephen asked Susan's secretary to dance. "Well, maybe it's time for us to follow the example of the bosses?" the girl asked him. "I promise, as long as you catch the bride's bouquet," joked Stephen. "Come on. Richard and Kimberly make such a handsome couple." "Hey, have you heard of Sandra?" "No, why?" "Donald's on trial for fraud, and Sandra's involved. In fact, she's cleaning floors at the mall right now. Can you believe that? My friend and I went to pick out a gift for the bosses and we saw her there." "Well, that's a good thing," nodded Stephen. The old woman was left with a broken trough. "Hey, look! The bride is about to throw her bouquet." In a couple of minutes Susan was already waving the trophy at him.